The sky was the color of wet ash, and the wind carried the cold breath of a coming storm. Dawn barely touched the edges of Dustwater Ridge, a town too small for mercy and too proud for shame. Snow melt from last night's frost clung to the porch railings, dripping into the thirsty dirt below, as if the town itself wept for what was about to unfold. Eliza Monroe stood barefoot on the wooden platform in the town square, her morning dress hanging loose on a body that had grown thinner with each passing winter. Her veil, once crisp and black, was now soft with age, like forgotten lace at the back of a drawer. The crowd gathered slowly, boots scuffing gravel, breaths forming ghosts in the morning chill. No one looked her in the eye. She didn't blame them. 3 months ago, she had buried the man who left her with nothing but a debt-ridden cabin, a broken clock, and his last name. Joshua Monroe had been a man of promises, most of them whispered sweetly between hymns and hard cider, all of them hollow as a bird's bone. By the time he died, he'd lost their land to gambling, their dignity to drink, and their future to recklessness. The bank took the house. The neighbors took their pity. And now the town took Eliza. It wasn't called a sale, of course. No one would call it what it was. Charity auction, they said, voices buttered with self-righteous concern. She'll work off what's owed. It's for her own good. A man stepped forward, clearing his throat like he expected applause. Reverend Pike. His boots were polished, his Bible tucked under his arm like a ledger. His voice rang out, clipped and certain, slicing the stillness. Friends, we gather not to punish, but to offer redemption. Widow Monroe stands here today as a soul in need of guidance and support. Let us offer both, as good Christians must. His eyes swept the crowd, but never lingered on her. The first bid came from Jeb Turner, a rancher with red teeth and a crooked belt buckle. $1 and a sack of cornmeal, he barked. Laughter followed. Not much, but enough to scrape. Eliza lifted her chin slightly. She didn't flinch. She had flinched the first time Joshua slapped her, and it had cost her weeks of peace. She had learned that stillness was armor, that silence was a weapon, and so she stood there, wrapped in both, her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the rooftops. Mrs. Cora Bell stepped forward, her hands clutched around a lace handkerchief. She whispered up to Eliza like a guilty prayer. I tried to speak against this, I swear I did, child. But no one listens to women past their bloom. I'm sorry. Eliza nodded once. That was all she could give. More bids came. A bag of flour, a stack of lumber, 3 hens, and a coat with one missing sleeve. Each offer struck like a slow knife, whittling away at what little dignity she'd managed to save for herself. Not one man said her name. Not one remembered she had once taught their children to read, that she had sung in church with a voice clear enough to stop fights in the back pews. Then, just as Pike raised his hand for the final call, a hush swept through the crowd like smoke slipping under a door. He had not made a sound, had not moved with drama or defiance, but his presence shifted the morning like a stone tossed into still water. A man stood near the edge of the crowd, apart from it, tall, wrapped in a wool blanket marked with deep red stripes and sky blue thread. His hair, braided with feathers and beads, fell over his shoulders. His skin held the warmth of river stone, and his eyes did not look at Eliza the way the others had. He did not inspect. He did not judge. He simply saw. No one said his name. No one needed to. He was Lakota, one of the few who had stayed near town after the treaties carved the land like a butcher's table. The children called him Ghost Hunter, and the men called him worse behind his back. But everyone knew this. He was not to be provoked. Pike's voice faltered just slightly. This is a civil matter, friend. Tribal business stays across the river. The man said nothing. He walked forward, his steps slow but certain, and stood at the base of the platform. The wind picked up, rustling his blanket, revealing a worn belt with a knife sheathed at his side, not for threat, but for truth. A working man's blade, honest and sharp. Eliza looked down at him. Their eyes met, and for the first time that morning, she felt her breath shift. Not stolen, not stilled, simply noticed. Are you placing a bid? Pike asked, voice thin now. The man turned to him, then back to Eliza. He nodded once. I offer 4 horses. 2 strong, 2 young, and this. He held up a small leather pouch, untying it slowly. Inside, a pendant glimmered, turquoise set in carved bone, the color of river ice under moonlight. Gasps scattered through the crowd. That necklace could buy a cabin and a winter's worth of supplies. It was not a bid. It was an offering. She ain't for sale to the likes of, someone began, but Pike raised his hand quickly. This is highly irregular, he muttered. We need consensus. Eliza spoke then, her voice dry but steady. Let me choose. The silence was a slap. No one had expected her to speak. No one had remembered she could. I'll go with him, she said. Pike sputtered. This isn't how it works. It is now. And just like that, it ended. She stepped down from a platform, shoes still tucked under one arm, and walked toward the man with bare feet touching the frost-bitten dirt. He didn't offer his hand, didn't take hers. They simply walked, side by side, down the center of the street. Behind them, the town watched, silent, angry, curious, small. Ahead of them, the prairie opened like a blank page, waiting for ink. As they passed the edge of town, Eliza whispered without looking at him. Why? His voice, when it came, was quiet, deep as a cave pool. Because no one should be traded for silence. She looked at him then, a flicker of something between gratitude and disbelief warming her frost-stung cheeks. And though no smile passed between them, something softer did. The wind shifted again. The storm would still come. But for now it paused, respectful, perhaps, of 2 souls walking away from a place that had forgotten how to see. They didn't look back. The prairie stretched wide and wordless beneath the sky, the color of pewter. Wind moved through the brittle grasses in hushed waves, whispering stories only those who listened with their hearts could hear. Eliza rode beside the man who had not bid for her, wrapped in a borrowed coat, her hands trembling not from cold, but from the unraveling silence between them. They had spoken little since leaving Dustwater Ridge, and yet something passed between them, steady, low as a river running beneath frozen banks. Trust, perhaps, or the beginning of it. The wagon they rode in was simple, old but cared for, the wood smooth from years of work and travel. 2 bay horses pulled it without complaint, guided by the quiet strength of the man whose name she had not yet asked. They stopped at a creek near dusk. He moved with quiet efficiency, unhitching the horses, gathering dry brush, laying stones for a fire. Eliza stepped down, her body aching from stillness, and bent to gather wood as well. When she handed him a bundle of twigs, his eyes met hers, not startled, but surprised. You help, he said. I'm not a statue, she answered. He gave the faintest nod, the closest thing to a smile she'd yet seen from him. That night, they sat on opposite sides of the fire. The flames licked the air between them, casting long shadows over the cottonwood trunks. Somewhere, an owl called out, slow and sorrowful. Eliza wrapped her coat tighter and studied the man through the flickering light. You traded 4 horses and a pendant to save me, she said at last. And you didn't ask for my name. He looked at the fire, then back at her. I will ask when you're ready to give it. She stared at him, waiting for some glint of manipulation, some hint of what he might want in return. But his eyes were like the night sky, deep, vast, and offering nothing but space to be seen. Eliza, she said softly. Eliza Monroe. He dipped his head in acknowledgement. I am Tahu Kang, he said. My people know me as one who walks with the wind. Some call me Ghost Hunter. That is only a story. Why did you take me? She asked, her voice catching slightly. You could have left me there. You didn't even bid. He stirred the fire slowly, choosing his words as one might choose stones for crossing a river. A bid is a price. You are not a thing with a price. I saw a cage. I had a key. Eliza looked down at her hands, scarred, knuckle-worn, pale. She had forgotten what kindness, without cost, felt like. She watched as he poured boiled water into 2 tin cups, handing her one without flourish. The tea was bitter but warming, made from crushed prairie herbs. She drank it slowly, letting the heat spread into her ribs. "Are you taking me somewhere?" she asked. "I have a cabin near Cedar Ridge. Quiet place. Good water, good sky. I'll leave you there, if you wish. Or take you farther, if you say." "You're not keeping me?" His eyes held steady. No one should be kept. Eliza turned her gaze to the trees, where snow clung to the bark like memory. She thought of the town, of Reverend Pike's rehearsed righteousness, of Jeb Turner's greedy eyes, of the women who watched her fall and said nothing. And then she thought of this man, whose hands worked without fanfare, whose voice carried no demand. They stayed beside the creek for 2 days. He built a small lean-to for her privacy and showed her how to set traps, how to grind sage leaves into poultices. In return, she cooked, her old instincts returning like birds after winter. They didn't speak often, but when they did, it mattered. She learned that his wife had died 3 winters past, fever and childbirth. That he had a daughter once, buried near the sweetgrass fields. That he had lived both love and loss, and wore both gently. On the 3rd morning, Eliza rose before the sun. She walked to the creek alone, breaking a thin layer of ice with a stick, watching the ripples fan out in widening circles. Her reflection met her gaze, older than she remembered, but steadier. She touched her cheek, felt the cold bite of morning, and the quieter warmth that had begun to bloom behind her ribs. Behind her, Tahu approached. His footfalls were light, respectful. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. As they rode towards Cedar Ridge, the land rose into gentle hills, scattered with wind-bent trees and black rocks polished by snowmelt. He showed her the tracks of deer, the wing prints of a hawk that had taken a rabbit in the night. She listened, not just to his words, but to the spaces between them, the reverence, the care, the peace he carried like a second skin. That night, the stars came out fierce and bright above the cabin he called home. It stood near a hollow built with thick pine logs and a porch that faced the open sky. Smoke curled from the chimney. Inside, the walls were lined with handmade shelves, each holding tokens of a life lived close to the earth. Carved bowls, woven blankets, dried herbs hanging in neat rows. He made up a bed for her near the hearth. She offered to sleep in the barn. He declined, without judgment, without insistence. "I've lived with ghosts," he said. "You are not one." She slept deeply that night for the first time in months. In the mornings that followed, Eliza found herself waking early to grind corn, sweep the porch, tend the fire. Tahu worked nearby, silent, always moving, always watching the sky, as if it spoke in ways people could not. They ate side by side. They sat near each other in the evenings, not as strangers, but as something not yet named. One afternoon, she found a notebook tucked into a shelf. Blank pages. She held it like something sacred. Her fingers remembered how to write, how to let ink bleed into paper like breath into lungs. When she asked if she might use it, he simply nodded. "Words are a kind of medicine," he said. That night she wrote. Slowly at first, then with urgency. Letters to herself, to the girl she once was, to the woman she was becoming. She wrote about the silence of prairie grass, the steadiness of a man who did not need to be loud to be strong. She wrote about being seen, not as a burden or a body or a widow, but as a whole person still in bloom. On the 5th day, a man came to the cabin, a trapper lean and pale-eyed, carrying news from Dustwater Ridge. He stayed long enough to trade meat for tools, then tipped his hat toward Eliza, as if recognizing her for the first time. "They're talking about you," he said. "Say you ran off with a savage, that you've been taken." Eliza raised her chin. "They can say what they like." Tahu said nothing. But when the trapper left, he stood for a long time by the window, staring out toward the direction of the town. She joined him, standing close enough to feel his breath but not his skin. "I don't want to go back," she said. "You may have to. I'm not afraid." He looked at her then, truly looked, his eyes soft, his voice low. "You've lived in cages long enough to forget what fear even is." Her throat tightened. She turned away. "Maybe," she whispered. "But I remember what dignity feels like, and I'd rather die with it than live under their mercy." That night, the fire burned long and low. The wind howled across the plains, but inside the cabin it was warm. She wrote until her fingers ached. When she laid the journal down, she found a bundle wrapped in cloth beside her bed. Inside, a carved quill made from river reed and bone, etched with symbols she did not yet understand. She pressed it to her chest. She didn't cry. Not yet. Outside, Tahu tended to the horses, humming a melody too old for language. He did not ask for thanks, did not ask for anything. But that night, when he returned, he did not sit apart from her. He sat near, just close enough for their knees to almost touch. They watched the flames flicker between them, and for the first time since Joshua died, Eliza felt the stir of something more than survival. Not passion, not longing, hope, quiet but undeniable. The fire crackled. He poured her tea. Neither of them spoke, and still everything was said. The river curved like a quiet question through the land, black beneath the thinning ice, reflecting sky and silence in equal measure. Snow clung to its edges in soft mounds, and the horses moved slow beside it, their breath puffing silver into the morning air. Eliza rode wrapped in wool, her hands hidden in mittens Tahu had sewn from deer hide and patience. It had been weeks since she first stepped down from the auction platform, and the weight of town voices no longer echoed in her mind the way they used to. The cabin had become more than a shelter. It had become a rhythm. She cooked while he carved. He hunted while she wrote. And at night they sat in companionable stillness, the fire talking for them in crackles and sighs. But this journey had a different feel. They were traveling farther than before, beyond Cedar Ridge, to a winter gathering where traders met to barter goods, news, and glimpses of the outside world. Tahu had asked if she wished to stay behind, and Eliza had shaken her head before he even finished the question. "I don't want to be hidden," she had said. So now they rode side by side along the water's edge, the earth still hard beneath a thin skin of snow. She watched him in profile, his eyes always scanning, his fingers relaxed on the reins, his presence quiet but grounding, like the spine of the mountains rising far in the distance. They stopped by the river to let the horses drink. Eliza knelt at the edge, scooping a handful of melted snow to sip. Tahu crouched beside her and pointed to where the current slowed. "There," he said. "See how the ice breaks? That's where stone softens. Water teaches it how to yield." She followed his gaze, watching the surface ripple where black met white, movement meeting stillness. She said nothing, but the lesson folded into her like breath. Later, they passed a broken wagon half buried in snow. A young couple stood beside it, their mule trembling with exhaustion. The man waved a tired arm. "Help us, please. We'll snapped and we've no tools." Tahu halted the horses. Eliza climbed down before he could say a word. She pulled off her gloves and crouched to inspect the splintered wood. Her hands moved confidently, her voice calm. "We can brace it with pine if we bind it tight. You've got rope." The woman blinked. "Yes, yes, in the pack." As Tahu unloaded supplies, Eliza guided the couple with the tone of someone who once commanded classrooms, who once soothed frightened children with steady words and soft eyes. They worked quickly, and within an hour the wheel held. The man offered coin. Tahu shook his head. Eliza only said, "Keep it warm tonight or it'll split again." As they rode on, Tahu glanced over. "You were a teacher." Eliza nodded. "Before Joshua." He waited. She didn't go on. That night, they made camp beneath a stand of pines. The fire flickered low. Tahu laid a blanket near the flames and handed her the last of the dried berries. She chewed thoughtfully, the sweetness sudden on her tongue. "I never wanted to marry him," she said finally. Tahu didn't answer, but the air between them changed. "I was 26. They said I was already an old maid. He had money, a name, and a temper I thought I could soften. I was wrong." She wrapped her arms around her knees, eyes reflecting the firelight. "I stopped singing. I stopped writing. I stopped laughing. When he died, I thought I might be free. But then the town decided they owned my name. My shame." Tahu spoke then, his voice low. "They didn't see you. Not truly. No." He added another log to the fire. It sparked, then settled into a quiet burn. "My wife," he said after a long silence, was gentle. She would braid feathers into my daughter's hair while I made arrows. She laughed even when the snow came early. I buried them both the same day. Fever. Eliza's throat tightened. She reached out slowly and laid her hand near his, close enough to feel warmth, not to grasp. He didn't move away. I'm sorry, she said. I carry their names, not their sorrow. She nodded. The next morning, frost glittered across their blankets. Eliza woke to find her journal tucked beside her boots, the carved quill resting atop it like a blessing. She opened to a clean page and began to write, not about sorrow, but about stillness, about kindness that expected nothing, about riverbanks and soft pine needles, and how grief could make room for grace. By midday, they reached the trading post, a scatter of tents and wagons arranged in a half-moon on a sunlit hill. Children played between campfires. Women bartered cloth for tin. Men passed pipes and quiet news. Eliza felt every eye turned toward her, but no one spoke. Tahu greeted several elders in Lakota, his voice respectful but not deferential. He walked beside her, not ahead. She noticed. An old woman approached, her braids silver as smoke. She studied Eliza's face for a long moment, then touched her shoulder gently. You walk with pain and fire, she said in accented English. Keep both. They will teach you. Eliza bowed her head. Thank you. They traded furs and herbs, a small carved flute, and 2 pairs of rabbit-hide boots. On the way back to their wagon, she paused beside a stall of small clay vessels. A bowl caught her eye, etched with river stones, painted in delicate circles. Tahu handed the trader a folded blanket without a word and placed the bowl in her hands. For you, he said, to hold your words. Her eyes stung. She blinked the tears back, not because she was ashamed, but because she was not ready to feel that much in front of so many. They began the journey home under a sky bruised with sunset. The river shimmered beside them, a silver path leading back to the world they'd begun to call their own. But when they crested the final hill, before the cabin, they saw 2 riders waiting near the porch. Men in dark coats, rifles strapped to their saddles. One was tall and sharp-jawed, his face too familiar. The other wore the badge of a debt collector. Tahu tensed. His horse shifted beneath him. Eliza felt her stomach turn to ash. The man stepped forward as they approached, voice cold. Eliza Monroe, you're wanted in Dustwater Ridge. Your husband's brother claims you fled legal obligations. There's a warrant signed by Judge Mason. You'll come with us. Eliza sat still, heart hammering, then dismounted slowly. I'll come, she said, voice calm. But I'll speak. This time I'll speak. Tahu turned to her, his brow furrowed. I can stop them. She shook her head. Not this time. Not with fists. With truth. He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. That night, they did not speak as they unpacked. But before bed, he stepped close and placed something in her hand. It was the carved pendant, the one he had once offered to buy her freedom. She looked up at him, breath caught. I gave it once to save you, he said. Now I give it because I see you. She curled her fingers around it, heart trembling. The fire burned low, and the wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, a new stillness had settled. Not silence, not fear, readiness. And beneath it, something soft as thawing stone. The saloon had been scrubbed down to resemble a courtroom, though no amount of whitewash could hide the bloodstains in the floorboards or the liquor ghosts in the walls. Dustwater Ridge had no courthouse, only this. Chairs dragged into rows, a plank bench for a judge, and a crowd that fed off spectacle like buzzards circling a dying calf. Eliza Monroe stepped inside, spine straight, boots laced tight. Her dress was plain, her shawl borrowed, but her eyes held something new, something not even the judge dared name out loud. The men who had once bid for her now shifted in their seats, suddenly aware that they were no longer watching a fallen woman. They were watching one rising. Her husband's brother sat at the front, arms folded, smugness like a stain on his collar. Charles Monroe, banker's son, God's favorite on Sunday, and a serpent the rest of the week. He didn't stand as she passed. He didn't need to. His kind didn't move for women. They made women move for them. Judge Mason cleared his throat behind the makeshift bench. "Eliza Monroe, you've been summoned to address the matter of unpaid debts tied to your late husband's estate. The claimant alleges abandonment and willful evasion." Eliza stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was low but clear, like river water slipping through stone. "My husband gambled away the land under our feet. He drank through every coin he ever earned. When he died, he left me with nothing but a name too heavy to carry and too bitter to bury." Murmurs fluttered through the room. The judge lifted a hand for silence. Eliza kept her gaze steady, not on the bench, not on the crowd, but on Charles. "I did not abandon my duties. I buried a man I didn't love, mourned a marriage that bruised me daily, and stood on a platform while this town auctioned me like livestock. And now you call me here to face debts that were never mine to begin with." Charles leaned forward, smiling as if her strength amused him. "You benefited from the union, Widow Monroe. Even now, you live in a house that was not yours to claim." The door creaked open. Tahu Keng stepped into the saloon like a shadow waking. His coat was dusted with snow, his eyes calm as mountain stone. He walked to the back of the room and stood there, silent, watching. Eliza felt something settle in her chest. Not relief, not rescue, anchor. She turned back to the judge. "The house I live in is built from logs his hands never touched. The land beneath it knows his name only as an echo. If that makes me guilty, then hang your noose high and clean. But if you're here for truth, then know this: I owe no man what he's already squandered." The judge blinked. Charles stood, indignation blooming across his face like an ugly rash. "She's trying to escape justice with that red-skinned savage. She's his now, like some stray taken from a road." The word cracked through the room like a slap. Eliza didn't flinch. She turned to the crowd slowly and looked them over, not with defiance, but with something older, deeper. "Every one of you saw me on that platform," she said. "You looked away. You let it happen. A man came and didn't bid. He didn't claim. He offered what he had with dignity. And I chose to walk beside him because he didn't see me as a burden or a debt. He saw me as someone still alive." Tahu said nothing. He didn't need to. He stood like a tree against a storm, steady and unmoved. The judge cleared his throat again, less sure now. "These are strong words, Mrs. Monroe. But feelings don't erase debt. The question is whether your claim of separation from your husband's affairs holds legal weight." Eliza reached into her shawl and drew out a folded piece of parchment. "I found this," she said, handing it to the clerk. "It's a letter my husband wrote, sealed and signed. In it, he admits to transferring property under false names to avoid taxes. He claims I knew nothing of it." Charles lunged forward, shouting, "That's forged." But the judge held up a hand. "It bears the proper seal, and the handwriting matches the bank's own records." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. When the gavel finally struck wood, it was not loud, but it was final. This court finds no grounds for debt recovery from the widow Monroe. She is absolved of financial responsibility tied to the late Joshua Monroe's estate. Case closed. A sound escaped her, a breath, long held, finally released. She stepped back as if her bones had gone soft. The crowd stirred again, some rising to leave, others still watching as if they'd missed the part where she was supposed to cry or scream or beg. She did none of those things. Outside, the air was sharp with cold. The clouds had scattered, and the wind had quieted to a hush. Eliza stepped down from the saloon porch and found Tahu waiting beside his horse. "You didn't have to come," she said. He looked at her, eyes unreadable, voice gentle. "I didn't come for them." She met his gaze. "I'm not broken anymore." His lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile. A recognition. "You never were." She looked down at her hands, rough, strong, ink-stained. Then up again, to the man who had seen her before she even saw herself. "I'm not going back," she said. "You don't have to." He moved to mount his horse, and for a heartbeat, she thought he might ride off, let her walk her own way like he always had. No chains, no promises. But then she reached for his hand, not in desperation, in choice. "Stay," she said softly. "Not because I need saving, but because I don't." He paused, then took her hand in his. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a sacred one. Agreement. Partnership. The kind that lasted beyond seasons, beyond names. They rode side by side through the open hills, past the place where the river bent, past the broken wheel where she first led again, past the quiet trees that had listened to their pain. When they reached the cabin, dusk was falling. Smoke coiled from the chimney, and the sky lit up with fire-colored clouds. Inside, she lit a lamp and placed the clay bowl he had once given her on the table. She filled it with paper, scraps from her journal, new pages, half-written songs. Words she hadn't been brave enough to speak aloud. Tahu watched her, then turned to the hearth. He added wood to the fire and warmed tea in the pot. They said nothing that night, and yet everything was said. Later, beneath blankets thick with scent of pine and smoke, Eliza stared at the ceiling, fingers wrapped around the pendant he had given her twice, once to free her, once to honor her. "You know," she whispered, "I used to think love was loud, demanding, grand." Tahu lay beside her, still and listening. "I think it might be this instead," she said, showing up, staying. He turned to her, his voice low. "It's knowing someone can stand alone, and choosing to stand with them anyway." She reached for him, hand resting against his chest, feeling the rhythm beneath. Slow, certain, alive. Outside, wind moved through the grass, but the storm had passed. The woman and the warrior lay beside the fire, not as savior and saved, not as wounded and healer, but as two souls who had learned to kneel beside grief, to walk through silence, to choose each other without chains. Some endings come with thunder. Others arrive on quiet feet, with steady hands and hearts that have nothing left to prove. Eliza slept that night not as a widow, not as an outcast, but as herself, whole, written in her own hand, standing on land that remembered her footprints. And Tahu slept beside her, not as the man who rescued her, but as the man who waited until she could rise on her own. They did not need vows or voices to bind them, only the fire, the river, and the truth that when seen fully, love doesn't rescue. It remains.